Well, thank you very much. So I'm Morten, and this is Mikkel. Just a few words of context. I'm working with mathematics education, and Mikkel is working with the philosophy of mathematics. And in this project, we are working together on investigating mathematicians' practice. And since you value values, you put values on the top. So I'll just start and Mikkel will take over and we will handle it. So the objective of our collaborative project is to investigate mathematical research practice in order to learn something about mathematics as a discipline. And especially in order to learn about how material artifacts, tools, algebra, drawings, computer software, how this plays a role in mathematical research practice. And in a very general way to develop knowledge that might eventually in some way be of value to mathematics education. So this is the overall objective of what we do together. The specific investigation that we'll talk about is a research, well, it's an interview study where we've interviewed 13 mathematicians about the way they work. We've interviewed them about how they solve problems, how they choose problems to work on, and how they work with the various material artifacts. How they collaborate. We've done the, well, typically you would say we've done the usual thing, recorded what they said, transcribed it, and put it into some of these coding software, create codes and analyze. Sampling criteria. We've worked with mathematicians in Denmark because we wanted to speak in Danish. Preferably, we wanted people to talk their mother tongue in these interviews, and we've then used sampling criteria like academic position. We've talked to mathematicians in good positions that are established mathematicians and in the middle of their career. We've only interviewed male mathematicians, very embarrassing, but it came out as a corollary of the other criteria. There are no female mathematicians in Denmark. But this is of course a huge. This is a problem, right? But this is what we have. We have done some analysis. We'll present to you. We're still in the process of working with the material. I must say also. Okay, for this specific talk, we wanted to show you something about how. What is the nature of the values that governs mathematical research practice? And what do we mean by that? We mean, what are the things, the concerns that governs the choices that the mathematicians do when they do their work? Okay, so we don't have a very specific conception of values here, but it has something to do with something that governs their practical choices when they work. How are these determined? Are they stable or unstable or changeable? And to what extent can we consider them situated? These are some of the questions. And we will also say a little bit about how these things can be investigated. The empirical basis of what we're going to say is what the mathematicians said about how they choose problem to work on, and how they communicate and prove their results. Now, before I leave the scene to me, I'll say a little bit about how mathematicians choose problems to work on. So this theme of the interviews actually emerged along the way, in the sense that we did 4 pilot interviews where we kind of tested, are we asking the right questions and so on, and we asked the question, how do you attack a problem? And all four responded, well, actually, it's something else that's interesting, mate. You don't want to know that. You want to know how I choose a problem to work on. So we included the question of how do you choose problem to work on in our interview guide, and actually showed that this was hugely important for all the mathematicians that we talked to. And so I'll just say the result of the analysis here. They seem to balance what they find interesting, what they feel for doing. They definitely are careful about choosing problems to work on where they kind of have a head start, where they have something to contribute. It should be realistic that it can gain some resources. And then they also consistently are interested in what other mathematicians find valuable. So this is just one sample from the interview. They all say that more or less, but this one says it specifically clear, right? How do you pick a problem that is suitable for you to work on? Well, I have three criteria. These three. So it has to be interesting. It has to be interesting to somebody else, and it has to be something where I can produce a result. Right? And they tend to say more or less these three criteria all of them. Of course, some of them have other criteria, but the management thing is interesting and so on. But that will only be a few of them. So much for the problem choice, and then maybe you can take over.
Yeah, we could perhaps add just a little thing that actually the last one here was hugely important. So we had several researchers who had actually given up research agendas that they found interesting themselves, but then they discovered that the community didn't really care. So there's no reason to do it anymore. And this guy, he also added, if no one reads it, you could just as well not have done it. So this is very important to come back to that in this way. So the next thing, he will present a little more of our data here. It was how the mathematicians, they go about making proofs and making arguments. And here we get a little into something that's been touched upon earlier here with the Hirsch, the front and the back, and so on. So what we found out here basically was that when mathematicians work, the informal reasoning play a huge role in their work. They always start with something, with a diagram, a picture, computer visualizations, things like that. And then they work with that and they use that to get ideas, and then they kind of get the formalism going. And this was clearly illustrated by this quote, for instance, here. This guy here, he had been explaining to me how important these diagrams and visualization was to him. And then he said, well, of course, because by the time you start to write things down formally, you already have to have some kind of idea about how you might solve the problem. And then you try to carry it out. So of course, you don't just start the formal proof on line 1 and then go on. You have to have some idea, and that idea, you get that by informal reasoning. And then I asked him if he still used the diagrams, and he said, and this is my favorite quote, he said, when you really get going right, it's simple as long as things go well. And when it goes bad, when you want to show something you don't know how to do it well, then you go back to thinking. So the formal thing here, that was, it adds on what John said in the very first talk here. The formalism, that's just doing. But thinking is something different. And thinking, that involves all the informal reasoning. Now there is one thing here, this can easily be constructed, or traditional, this could be constructed as a dualism between heuristics and verification. But this would actually be wrong. This would be simplification. What we saw here was that the informal reasoning actually carried a lot of epistemic weight to these people, because they knew, not all of them, but some of them were acutely aware that formal reasoning, we're not very good at formal reasoning, humans. So formal reasoning can go wrong. And in many situations, the informal reasoning is more robust than formal reasoning. So one example one would give me was, you can easily mistake this for this when you do kind of a formal calculation. If you have 10 pages of formal calculation and I deliberately put in this mistake, what are the odds that you will find it? They're not very big, I guess. But if you have the corresponding diagram, you would not mistake going from here to here with going, well, here and then jumping over here, something like which the other one would. So in a way, what they actually wanted was these two kind of arguments to correspond in the end. So they wanted the formal argument, but they also wanted, before they were kind of convinced, they also wanted the informal argument to show the same thing. So the informal reasoning was not just heuristics, it also had an epistemic component. And we have a lot of, I won't go through all of it, but this is just to say the informal reasoning plays a huge role in mathematical thinking, both in heuristics and in epistemics. So when we go to the publications they make, of course this enormously, hugely important thing would be there, you would expect. But as well now, and as Hirsch points out, it is not, when you write the paper, the diagrams and the figures and so on, they kind of tend to fall out. So we just have some quotes here to show that. So I asked him here, oh, that was Morten, I think, actually, conducted this. So, do you use some of these pictures or visualizations in your papers? And you would say, well, a few selected ones. And I use them, well, when I give a talk, I use them relatively much because it actually constitutes a very convincing argument when you can show a picture to people and say, there you see. So, oh, and this one also, this quote also reflects that the informal argument has actually epistemic weights to him. So what we see here, and what we saw in several quotes, was that when you write papers, the informal arguments, they tend to fall out. But when you give talks, you do something different. Then you keep the informal arguments, you keep the diagrams and pictures and so on. So you might say that there are two different contexts here for presenting your work. So you do one thing when you're at a conference or when you present to your colleagues, but you do something differently when you write a paper for a journal. And this is different. You might wonder, is this a natural thing? No, it's, well, for instance, in philosophy, it's not that uncommon that you go to a conference and then you read your paper. So in philosophy, there's not such a huge difference, but there is in mathematics. And I'll just show you one more, because it was nice. There was a guy, he was working, this is kind of a picture showing matrices. And this was the central artifact in his work. So he had this all over his table in different variations. This was what he was thinking with. And then I asked him, or then he said, well, when I write a paper, then this thing, and he points to this, will not be in it. In the paper I'll write something formal and short, which shows the same thing. But really, it should be included, because if I give a talk or try to explain it to anybody, I would draw the figure. And this is interesting for several reasons. Well, one is here, well, he tells us that if he wants to explain this to anybody so they understand it, then he will use the figure. But when I write the paper, I don't have the figure, and then you can figure it out whether he wants the people to understand what he's actually writing. Another thing which is interesting here is that, that the choice of leaving the figure out is not natural to him. And this here, he was a relatively influential professor of mathematics in Denmark. But still, he's not allowed to, he cannot say, oh, I'll be damned, I want the figure in my paper, so I'll put it in and then they just have to print it. He cannot say that. There are some standards that he has to comply to, which he cannot choose, even though he doesn't find them natural. So this is an important thing to keep in mind here. You just have to comply to the standards of the society. And just, I have a few others here. These are just quotes to show that the mathematicians here, all of them are well aware about what they are supposed to do when they write papers. So one here he would say, he had also been explaining a lot about all the figures he'd be using in drawings, and then he says here, but that is not how we write papers, we mathematicians. We write papers by filling in the calculations, or at least, otherwise you won't get it accepted. So he's well aware what of the demands he has to comply to. And there's another one here. He says, well, if you overdo it with the diagrams, it's not something the referees will mind upon. But then, on the other hand, I have been in a situation where a referee thought it might be a good idea with an additional figure. So they're not completely left out, but they're trying to comply to standards that others have, that the society have. And they are well aware of what they should do. So that was the empirical part. So let's go back to philosophizing, analyzing. So we asked 3 questions. How are the values situated? Well, from the last example here with the diagrams, with the proofs and arguments, the answer is they're clearly situated. You do something different is expected of you, whether you're presenting it at a conference or whether you're writing a paper for a journal. So that makes our job a little bit harder when we are trying to figure out what are the values of mathematics, because these values are situated. You cannot just ask, does mathematicians value explanation per se? You have to ask in what situation. They might value explanation at a conference, but they might not value it as much in a paper. So the values here seem to be situated, at least in this aspect of mathematics. The next question here, are they stable or are they governed by some kind of fashions or shifting, unstable, you might say. And also here we see perhaps what we call we will argue for a continuous model. So we see at least some values that seem to be shifting, and those could be the values of problem choice. And why are they? Why do we believe that they are shifting or unstable? Well, it's because the mathematicians they are not sure about what is valued. They have to look to what the others are thinking all the time. So is this work? Will this work be liked by the others? I cannot know it just by sitting in my office. I have to go and talk to people, and so there's a lot of. In fact, there's a lot of does my butt look big in this dress kind of reasoning going on here. They have what's it called, emphatic reasoning. They have to find out what others think about them. And this tells us that these values, they must be in flux somehow. You cannot just write down a list. Whereas if we look to the proof case here, the mathematicians, they seem to be quite well aware of what they're expected to do. And this shows us that these values are at least relatively stable. So I think that was what I would say.
I'll just finish up here, because a little afterthought, how can we then investigate these values? So we've seen 2 types of values, one that are more in flux and one that are more stable. What we think is that at least when it comes to the mathematician's problem choice, it is very interesting to understand the process aspect, understand how they actually choose the problem that they work on. It might not be worthwhile making a long list of what is an important mathematical problem. Well, it could be part of it, but when they work, mathematicians, they are very interested in how other people will look at their work, and they are able to make very explicit the values that governs their problem choice. So this type of work where you go and talk to people will be a good way of understanding the process aspect of and fast changing values. Whereas the more stable values, such as the values that governs mathematical proof, is more, well, I guess there's a variety of methods that can be used here, but it makes sense to do more reasoning and more philosophical approach to this. I guess that's more or less it. And isn't this?
Yeah, perhaps the last thing we should add is that all of this also, at least in our views, shows that there's a large social components to mathematics, because many of these values here, they seem to be located in the communities, in the mathematical community as such. So both what the mathematicians, when they choose problems, they kind of have to comply to decisions made by the society as a whole, and when they present or choose how to present their proofs and their arguments, what is considered valid argument in this or that situation, they also have to comply to some rules which are somehow negotiated by the mathematical society. And especially this here, it could be interesting to see kind of what are the mechanisms, how do they make these choices, how do the mathematical society actually choose now this kind of problem is valuable, but we don't know that. I mean, you can just point to the kind of method you might apply to solve this problem. So, yeah, I think that was, so we have time for questions, and here the contact information if anybody wants to know more. But let's just have a discussion.